When we tell people about Stemmons, we often get a question, what is it? And a quick way of answering that is to say, well, it's an enterprise operations platform. And the next question typically is, okay, well, what is an enterprise operations platform? And in this presentation, I'm going to tell you about that and also mix in a little bit of history, which I hope you find as interesting as I do. The first thing I'd say is there are a lot of things that happen in any enterprise that have to happen on a regular basis, regardless of the industry. So these are the kinds of things, it doesn't matter what kind of business you're in, these are the kinds of things that one has to be good at. And when we think about who is good at these kinds of things, like capturing information, tracking, analyzing, that kind of stuff, we'll start with somebody like this. This is Fra Luca. He wrote what is essentially the very first book on accounting. Okay, accountants have been good at this kind of stuff for a long time. This guy worked with Leonardo da Vinci, wrote a book in 1400 and something that really codified how to keep track of things. And he wasn't the first one to be doing this kind of stuff. Here's a tablet from 20 BC that talks about kind of how to keep track of maybe it's Egyptian grain silos, something like that. And in fact, even thousands of years ago, this is a bola from 3,000 or 4,000 BC. So really long time ago, but it was used as a marker to keep track of inventory, essentially. And so we look at the accounting department and we say, these guys have been good forever at keeping track of things, of recording, of having good data, of knowing where everything is. It all ties together. They've got a perfect system. And so that's a great source of information in an organization. Anybody know what this is? This is a pictorial version of Plato's allegory of the cave. Okay? So the idea here is that you've got a bunch of prisoners sitting down there in the cave. They're seeing the shadow of something on the wall, but they can't see what's actually going on. They can only see but a shadow. Okay? And the idea is that they don't know what's really happening. They only see a representation of it, and there's a whole philosophical discourse with Socrates that goes past this. But basically the idea here is that people are only seeing a shadow of what's actually happening. And there's a similar story that I'm going to tell about business. Okay, so here we have some people in an organization, and here we have this kind of magic projector, and what's going into it is information about operations and also information from an executive level. Okay, and we also have people that are involved in the company from outside. They might be vendors or consultants or customer information that we're getting, plus there's a whole bunch of stuff that kind of comes in that we don't even know essentially where it comes from. It might be market things or stuff that's beyond our control or even our discrete knowledge. And all of that gets mixed together into what we think of as the financial results of the company, which get projected in the form of financial reporting. And that's what people in operations are typically looking at, okay? Because we understand that the financial reports are well maintained and they represent good data and so forth, but what is interesting about it is, much like the prisoners in Plato's allegory, people in operations who are looking at financial results are not seeing what's actually happening. Okay, what they're seeing is a representation of what's actually happening that includes a whole bunch of other stuff that is beyond their control or even knowledge, and also, by the way, it is backward looking because the financial results don't represent real-time data. They are issued typically at the end of the month, and sometimes it takes a long time for things to show up in the financials, even if they're happening in real time. In the meantime, let's talk about lobsters. Okay, and lobsters are interesting because back in the day, they were seen very differently as they're seen today. Okay, today we understand lobster is a delicacy. It's a luxury item. It's often talked about in the context of limousines and caviar and champagne, and it's something that we see as a high-end, desirable, sought-after thing. Meanwhile, it used to be something that was fed to prisoners. David Foster Wallace wrote a great article about it where he talked about the fact that in early New England, there were actually laws about not feeding too much lobster to prisoners because it was considered to be cruel, right? You weren't allowed to feed them too much because it was too mean. Instead, they would crush them up and use them for fertilizer. So a lot has changed now. We used to throw this stuff away. We used to think of it as not interesting, and now we recognize it as a very sought after and expensive and valuable item. Well, there's something else that's a lot like lobster, and it's operations data, okay? So we have things happening in our company, and we're treating it like people used to treat lobster. Okay, we're just throwing it away. Things happen in our organization, but we're not capturing that information. And I think in the future, and it's increasingly starting to be the case, that direct native information about operations is highly valuable, should be seen as a very desirable luxury item, something that we would never throw away or just kind of toss out casually, but that we would pay very close attention to. And having an operations platform like Stemmons allows us to do that. So let's talk about how. Stemmons Central, it's a user-defined system. It orders unstructured activities, consolidates business functions, it adapts to any company, and it's used by everybody in the organization. And another thing it does along the way is it captures information about what's happening in every aspect of the organization natively. So if we think about things like stem cells or an erector set, which is kind of an old-fashioned toy that could be used to build all kinds of different things, maybe a 3D printer, the primary colors that it's only 3 colors, but they make millions of colors, or the elements that make everything around us, including our own bodies. Stemmons Central is kind of like that. Okay, it's an abstract system that can be configured to do all these different things, but in its native state, it's just kind of a set of tools, and it's up to us to decide how to use it in an organization. So here's some examples of things that we can do. Okay, so one, think about the concept of surveys, checklists, or inspections. They have a standard pattern. Okay, there's a question. The question has possible answers. The answers might have points associated with them. There might be a rule associated with the answer, okay, and an action that happens on the basis of that rule. And now that pattern exists everywhere with anywhere we look in the company. It could be, is the grass in good condition? Did the backup of the computer system run? How many parking spots are there? Do you recommend us to your friends? Is that USB port disabled? Maybe we're doing cybersecurity. Or is the vendor's insurance in order? It really could be anything, but the pattern exists the same way. All we need to do is decide what's the question, what are the possible answers, are we keeping track of points, and is there a rule that happened that we want to invoke, and what's the action that we take as a result of that. So, for example, we might be doing a security patrol report. We have a security guard who's going through and they're asking all these questions. Was the door locked? Were any lights on? Did you check the parking garage? So on and so forth. And we may be doing something totally different, like looking at a permit and saying, hey, do we have a permit for this? Do we have a permit for that? Is it in good order? And by the way, if the elevator permit is out, we need it to go to the engineer. But if the occupancy permit is not there or it's out of date, then we need it to go to the asset manager. Here's something for taking over a new property. There's a whole bunch of questions and things that we need to do. We can kind of have the rule be create those tasks and assign them to the right person. And in fact, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of things like this in an organization that fit this pattern, and we can use an operations platform like Stemmons to handle all of those things regardless of the underlying content. So do you know who these guys are? Woodward and Bernstein, right? Famous reporters. And we don't need to be those guys, right? We don't need to go look for everything all the time and be hunting and being investigators. If we're capturing data in the system, we can look directly at that data and have it flow up in the form of data visualizations and reports. We can be exception-based, and we can have our attention naturally drawn to the things that require it, as opposed to having to go and hunt and dig and figure out, with a tremendous amount of effort, what's actually going on. Here's another kind of concept that comes up in a universal operations platform. And this is the universal to-do list. Okay? So take any to-do list. Let's just think about the pattern here. Okay, we've got tasks for the accounting department. It's going to have a bunch of columns along the top. It's going to have a bunch of rows or items, and there'll be a bunch of things filled in there, and that represents a kind of standard to-do list. We might have another one for work orders. Okay, the columns are different, the items are different, but the pattern is the same. Same for, hey, there's a shopping list for a holiday party. What are we going to get? Who's responsible? What store are we going to? What's its status? And so on and so forth. So the idea is we can take all of those separate lists, if they're in one system, and we can combine them and splice and dice them based on anything we want. Okay, so maybe I want to see the things that are assigned to me regardless of what list they're on. Maybe I want to see the thing that's on my team's lists. Maybe I want to see things that relate to large customers, or things that are past due, things that relate to a particular location. Really, if we have one system that's universal, we can look at these lists in any way that we want, and because we can configure the system to accommodate any list, it's going to handle anything that we think of. Okay? So what ends up happening is we can keep track of everything in one place. We can see how many things are open. We can look at all the past history of things. We can even assign people responsibility to certain types of lists or certain types of items. And as a result, we can find information that we're looking for very, very easily. It kind of jumps out right at us. It's where are things past due? Where do we have an opportunity to do things better? It's kind of a little bit like this game from the book, Where's Waldo? But just imagine, instead of having to actually comb through all of that, if Waldo would kind of magically jump out and appear, and not only Waldo, but his friend or his dog and his shoes and so forth. And if you didn't even really have to look, now it wouldn't be fun for the game, for Where's Waldo, but in your business, you don't want to be playing Where's Waldo, right? You don't want to be having to comb through and find things and look and decide. As you want those things to jump right out at you as exceptions. That's becoming exception-based using data, and that's really where we want to be and where we can be with an operations platform. Automation, okay? Think of things that happen on a regular basis. We've got a task, we've got a schedule, we've got different situations that might apply to it, and assignments based on that particular situation, and then finally there's some information, some language that goes with it, okay? So, it could be, again, it could be anything. It could be, hey, you've got to do your part of the budget process, or we should test the generators because it's that time of year where we have hurricanes, or, we want you to contact your customers that have had a lot of complaints recently and talk to them. Say happy birthday, do your permits, a debt service coverage ratio analysis. I mean, it really could be anything. Right? If you look at your organization, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of tasks that fit that description, where we've got something, we only want it to happen in certain situations, but if that situation is there, then we want it to be assigned to somebody, we want to tell them what to do. Okay? So we do that kind of stuff again and again. Here's acknowledging something, and again, here's just a huge number of those things that happen in a typical organization. In a system like Stemmons, we can accommodate those things, and it creates, in some ways, that mythical perpetual motion machine. Is those tasks will continue to happen on a scheduled basis without anybody having to do any extra work until somebody stops that from happening. Okay? Very, very, very helpful in an organization to not have to spend the time remembering all those things, reminding people, and picking up where people have forgotten to do it. Standardization, okay? What we want to look at is how can we take something that happens in a lot of different departments that doesn't really need to be different and make it similar, okay? So that we're following a standard methodology. So in this particular case, we're talking about meetings, okay? We want to have a standard meeting in different areas of the company. We call them structured meetings, okay? We want to have a certain agenda that gets followed. We want it to happen on a regular basis. And with that agenda, we want people to have access to the information that they'll need. Okay, so we can schedule these standard meetings on a regular basis. They have a common agenda. We call this structured meetings, and there's some videos on it and so forth on our website. But the idea is that we don't have to worry about that, and we also are able to not only do it consistently and have that standardization, but we're also able to provide documentation. And now I'm getting into another benefit. Okay, if we think about where documentation is in a company, typically it's scattered all over the place. Like there's no one repository for it. Okay, what a platform like Stemmons allows us to do is to hold that information in one place, have a common place that people can go to get documentation. It's available on their phone, it's available on their computer, and we can look at it in a lot of different ways, but we can do some other things that are interesting as well. Okay, we can see what's new, right? What's been updated recently. We can see who's responsible for a particular piece of content. We've got different departments. We've got topics that we can look at and dive right into. We can see what's being used, what people are looking at. And also, most importantly, ownership is who's responsible for that? How do we have governance over our processes? A system like Stemmons allows us to do that so that we can not only know where everything is, but know if it's fresh and know who's responsible for it and know if it's being used. Another concept is recognition, is if we have that good data, if we have that base operations data that's being captured when people are doing things, then we can identify people that are doing good and interesting things, not just look at the financial data that's out of date and commingled with other content. So, hey, we have this thing called Badger, right? And it automatically assigns badges to people based on doing things, like in this case, being on the yearbook committee, which is captured in the system, but also it could be anything, right? It could be how many days without an incident. It could be your customer satisfaction score, how many bank accounts you've reconciled, how many tours you've given. Because we have that base data in the organization, we can understand what people are doing, and we can call out people that are doing a particularly good job of things, which is something that is very difficult to do if you don't have a system and a platform that gives you that base data. Also, if we think about kind of what this means for us, right? What does it mean for me? I'll tell you kind of my version of this, and this is the case for someone who's using a system like Stemmons as well, is we start off in a traditional kind of old-fashioned way of working where we're kind of investigators. Hercule Poirot from Agatha Christie books is we're trying to find the problems, right? And that finding of the problems requires a lot of work sometimes. It's like that Waldo stuff. Once we would find the problems, then we would have to fix the problems. We would become Mr. Wolf from Pulp Fiction. We're a fixer. We're going to get in there and make it happen and direct traffic and make decisions and see them happen. Okay. As we started having systems like Stemmons, we didn't have to find those problems anymore. Instead, what we did was we were architects. Okay. I would find a problem and architect a solution, a decision, an intervention, a process. And once that process started happening, then we didn't have to be detectives anymore. The problems would find themselves. Okay? And after a while, we started getting better at that kind of stuff. And we have enough of those things going on in the organization that we become like Leonard Bernstein. I forgot to say, I am Pei, one of my favorite architects. So we went from being I am Pei to being Leonard Bernstein, and now we're conducting the orchestra. We're watching these things happen throughout the organization, but a funny thing happens as well as we get good at architecting those solutions and making them happen in concert, and the fixes start happening themselves. We're catching things earlier. we don't have to parachute in and start calling shots anymore, is the problems are surfacing, the solutions are surfacing as well, and it's much more about designing things and orchestrating things than it is about finding things and fixing them. And with a system like Stemmons, we can do that not just in one place in the organization, but universally across the entire organization. So that's some of the things that come along with having an enterprise operations platform where we have that data and we can use it and put it to use in a variety of ways that are extremely impactful for the company. So I hope this helps explain a little bit about what we mean and why it's so important and why it can be so transformational for your business. Thanks.